Today, I'm telling you a story so patient it waits, set against the harsh beauty of the western frontier, where the desert breathes and solitude can crush a man. It's a place where survival is routine, but hope is rare, and destiny arrives without warning. This story began with a quiet moment, an ordinary sign nailed into sunburned wood, yet its impact reached far beyond what anyone expected. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Silence ruled Lone Mesa in the year 1884. Not the gentle quiet of evening, but a weighty stillness that pressed down like stone on a man's chest. It clung to the land, etched into the red rock and burned into the dust. Out there, days stretched long beneath a brutal sun, heat wavering above the ground until the world felt brittle and unmoving. When night finally arrived, it came sharp and cold, filled with the distant cries of coyotes drifting in from the ridgelines. The mesa rose alone from the desert, an island of stone surrounded by sand and yucca, its cliffs guarding a plain where little dared to grow. It was a harsh place, unyielding and merciless. And it was there that Crow had chosen to build his ranch. Crow lived alone. He spoke little. He carried himself like a man carved from the same rock that sheltered his home. At 33, he should have still been young by frontier standards, but his face told another story, one marked by loss and long nights without rest. He was Apache by blood and spirit, though the government in Santa Fe had spent years trying to bind him with papers and treaties. None of it mattered. Ink could not change a man's soul, nor could it fill the emptiness in his eyes. The sun had toughened his skin. The wind had hardened his posture. His dark hair hung long and bound back, and he moved through the world with constant caution. The mesa neighbors, few and far between, whispered that he was a ghost walking his own land. They were closer to the truth than they knew. Crow had not always lived in silence. There was a time when laughter echoed off the canyon walls, when the ranch felt like a beginning instead of a grave marker. That was before the fever came. 2 winters earlier, sickness swept through the valley without warning or mercy. It took Mary, his wife, and Eli, their young son, in a matter of days. Crow, a man strong enough to break wild horses and raise fences by hand, could do nothing. No rifle, no blade, no strength of will could fight what crept unseen through their blood. He watched helplessly as the light of his life faded, and when the fever finally passed, it left him hollow. Since then, Crow spoke less. He worked more. He buried his grief in routine. The house stood solid, the corrals straight and sturdy, but the man inside had turned to stone. For 2 years he lived that way, rising before dawn, laboring until his body ached, sleeping only when exhaustion dragged him down. He ate to survive, jerked meat, hard biscuits, coffee boiled black and bitter. Food was fuel, nothing more. And the silence never left, nothing more. He asked nothing from the world, not comfort, not companionship. He survived by endurance alone. But even stone will split if pressed long enough. It wasn't that Crow craved company. He didn't miss conversation or laughter. What wore him down was the emptiness of the house itself. The silence had grown thick, almost tangible, settling over the rooms like a burial cloth. It followed him from doorway to doorway, pressing close, refusing to leave. So, a few weeks before fate truly stepped in, Crow did something he never expected of himself. He took a rough plank cut from scrap wood and heated a branding iron until it glowed. The sharp scent of burned timber filled the air as he pressed the iron down, carving simple words into the grain. Help wanted cooking. Stock work. He carried the plank to the edge of his land, near the wagon road where dust never fully settled, and nailed it to a lone post. He didn't do it believing anyone would answer. Who would ride this far into nothing to work for a silent, broken man? No. He put it up because the emptiness inside the house had grown louder than the wind outside. Weeks slipped by. Riders passed the sign without slowing. They took in the barren land, the isolated house, and chose distance over trouble. From the porch, Crow watched them go, arms folded across his chest, hat brim pulled low, eyes sharp and unreadable. He looked like a hawk perched above the desert, detached and waiting. He expected nothing. He believed the silence would outlive him. But destiny has a way of arriving quietly. It came one early spring afternoon, when dust lifted lazily along the wagon road, and the air carried the dry, bitter scent of mesquite. From the far end of that empty stretch appeared a small cart, its wheels protesting with every turn. The horse pulling it was gaunt and weary, ribs showing beneath its hide, stumbling from exhaustion. The woman holding the reins, however, sat straight. She was near 30, her dark hair pulled back beneath a plain bonnet worn thin by travel. Her face was pale from the road, drawn by miles of hardship, yet there was a steadiness to her, an unmistakable strength that dust and sun had not broken. Her dress was frayed at the hem, marked by long days and longer journeys. She brought the cart to a halt beside the weathered sign. Crow had seen her long before she reached it, the plume of dust announcing her arrival. He stood on the porch, leaning against a post, watching as she climbed down. Her boots struck the ground with purpose. She lifted her eyes to the house. She saw the wind-scarred boards, the sagging porch, the windows dulled by neglect. Many would have turned back right then, reading the loneliness written into the wood itself, the work, the isolation, the grief embedded in the place. She didn't. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the porch, toward the man standing guard over his solitude, like a statue carved from the land itself. "You the owner?" she asked. Her voice was steady, edged only by the fatigue of long travel. Crow answered with a single nod. "Crow," he said. She paused, just long enough to measure him, then spoke. "Emma Brooks, I saw your sign." Crow's eyes shifted briefly to the plank nailed to the post, its burned letters dark against the wood, before returning to her face. He felt the urge to warn her rise in his chest, to tell her this land swallowed beginnings whole, that most folks took one look and kept riding. "Plenty of people pass that sign," he said. "They don't stop." "I didn't pass it," she replied. The wind pushed against the porch boards, making them groan. Somewhere in the brush, a grasshopper clicked in the stillness. The silence stretched between them, thick, watchful. For the first time in 2 years, it carried a question. Crow studied her then. He saw the road weariness in her eyes, the dust clinging to the hem of her dress. But beneath that, he saw something deeper. Grief, packed tight and heavy, a sorrow he recognized all too well. "I don't need trouble here," he said, his voice flat. "I've had my share." Emma didn't flinch. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said quietly. "Just honest work." There was something in the way she said it, plain, unguarded, that struck him. His gaze drifted past her to the cart. One small trunk, a mandolin case lashed beside it, everything she owned, reduced to a few worn belongings. It reminded him of his own house, the cold stove, the empty rooms, the silence that wrapped the place like a burial cloth. Crow looked back at Emma Brooks, standing firm in the dust. After a long moment, he spoke. "Kitchen's around back, side room's empty, pump's by the well." She gave a slight nod. "That'll do," There was no handshake, no smile, just two people facing each other across a threshold neither had crossed in years. As Emma stepped past him to fetch her trunk, her skirt brushed his coat. Barely a touch. It should have meant nothing. But Crow felt it like a spark struck in dry grass. Sudden. Unsettling. And just like that, the hollow man was no longer entirely alone. The silence of Lone Mesa had begun to shift. There is a sound a wagon makes after too many miles across high desert. A dry, rhythmic complaint. Wood grinding against iron. Wheels arguing with the earth itself. That sound cut through the stillness on an early spring afternoon, announcing an arrival the land had not asked for. The air was parched, carrying the sharp, sweet scent of mesquite mixed with dust. The woman holding the reins sat straight-backed. The horse did not share her strength. It was little more than ribs and hide, head bowed with every step, worn down by heat and distance. But the woman did not bend. She was near 30, dark hair pulled tight beneath a bonnet faded by sun and miles. Her face was pale from the trail, drawn by hardship, yet steady. There was resolve in the way she held herself, something the road had not taken. She guided the cart to a halt beside the weathered sign. Dust clung to her skin, and weariness showed in the lines of her face. Yet beneath the strain of travel lived a quiet resolve. Her dress was plain, the hem torn and frayed from miles of hard ground. She brought the cart to a stop beside the weathered board Crow had nailed up weeks earlier, its burned letters still visible. Help wanted cooking. Stock work. She climbed down, boots striking the dirt with a firmness earned by long roads and longer trials. She didn't lower her gaze. She looked straight ahead. She studied the house, the boards scarred by wind, the porch sagging under years of neglect, the windows dulled by dust and time. Most folks would have seen nothing but a ruin, a place where hope had withered and blown away. She did not turn back. Drawing in a breath of thin desert air, she squared her shoulders and walked toward the porch where Crow waited. He had been watching her long before she reached the sign, arms folded tight, hat brim pulled low to shadow his eyes. His stare was sharp and guarded, like a hawk circling high above open land. He was a man who had forgotten how to greet a stranger, a man who wore solitude like armor. "You the owner?" she asked. Her voice was level and steady, roughened only by dust and distance. Crow gave a single nod. Crow. She paused for a heartbeat, then met his eyes. Emma Brooks. I saw the sign. His gaze flicked to the plank nailed to the post and back again. He hadn't wanted this. Not the interruption, not the presence. Plenty of folks pass that sign, he said, the warning plain. They don't stop. I didn't pass it, she replied. Silence settled between them. The porch boards groaned as the wind pressed against them, and somewhere in the brush, a grasshopper clicked in steady rhythm. It felt like a standoff between two people who had forgotten how to speak softly. At last, Crow broke it. You know stock? Cooking? Emma lifted her chin. I do, and I work hard. He studied her closely, looking past the dust-stained clothes into the steadiness of her eyes. The exhaustion was there, unmistakable, but so was something else. Grief, packed deep and heavy, the same kind he saw staring back at him every morning. I don't need trouble here, he said flatly. I've had enough. Her answer came quiet, but firm. I'm not looking for trouble. I just need honest work. Something in her words struck him. He glanced toward the cart. One small trunk. A mandolin case tied beside it. That was all. Everything she owned in the world. Not much of a life, he thought. And then his mind turned to his own house. The cold stove, the empty rooms, the silence that filled them like a shroud, the cold stove, the vacant rooms, the silence that wrapped the house like a burial cloth. Crow stood there longer than he meant to. At last, he lifted a hand toward the building, the gesture rough and imprecise. "Kitchen's around back," he said. "Side room's empty. Pump's by the well." Emma answered with the slightest nod. "That'll be fine?" There was no handshake, no smile. Only two strangers standing on opposite sides of a doorway that neither had truly crossed in years. Emma turned back toward the cart to collect her belongings. Crow watched her. He didn't offer help. Maybe from habit, maybe because something in him knew she wouldn't take it. She lifted the heavy trunk on her own and carried it across the porch with a steady, unhurried stride. And then it happened. As she passed him on the narrow boards, her skirt brushed his coat. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. A nothing thing. Barely a touch. Yet to a man who had turned himself to stone, who hadn't felt another human's closeness in 2 long winters, it struck like fire in dry grass. Sudden, unsettling, dangerous. Inside, the house lay dim and quiet. Stale air lingered beneath dust-heavy curtains, and the floorboards groaned under Emma's boots as she stepped farther in. She stopped, taking it in. There was emptiness, yes, but where others might have seen ruin, Emma saw the frame of something waiting to be restored. The bones of a home. She set her trunk in the side room and let her hand trail across the rough surface of the dresser. Solid. Real. Shelter. Without delay, she returned to the kitchen, where the stove sat cold and dark. Crow lingered near the doorway, half inside, half out. "Do you have coffee?" she asked. Crow blinked, as if pulled from a distant place. "Beans are in the jar by the shelf." Emma untied her bonnet, shook loose the dust from her hair, and went to work without another word. She filled the kettle at the pump, measured the beans, struck a match. The sound of flame catching filled the room. It was a sound the house had not known in a long time, not the bare fire of survival, but the deliberate kind meant to warm a space. The rich scent of coffee began to rise, slow and comforting. Crow stayed where he was, watching. The feeling unsettled him. It had been years since anyone else had moved through that kitchen with purpose. Years since the house carried sounds that weren't his alone. Emma didn't chatter. She asked no questions. She worked in silence, the practiced quiet of someone who understood it well. Crow found himself leaning against the doorframe longer than he intended, drawn in by the steady certainty of her hands. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups. She set one on the table across from her own, without asking if he wanted it. Then she sat. Crow stared at the cup as steam curled upward from the dark surface. He studied her face. Emma Brooks met his eyes without wavering. There was no smile. No easy warmth offered. What passed between them wasn't friendliness, not yet. It was recognition. The quiet understanding shared by 2 people who had buried more than they ever meant to speak of. Outside, the wind worried at the windows, and the mesa stretched wide and still. But inside, for the first time in a long while, Crow felt the air in his house shift. Just enough to sense that something had crossed the threshold with the woman who now sat at his table. Neither of them named it. They didn't have to. They drank the coffee in silence, bitter and hot. And both of them knew the quiet had changed. It was no longer hollow. It was waiting. Morning came pale and cold, dawn washing thin light across the desert floor. The chill carried the kind of bite that settles deep in the bones before the sun can soften it. Crow rose, as he always did, pulled on his boots, and stepped toward the corral. He expected silence. For 2 years, that was all he had known. The scuff of hooves, the rattle of wind, the steady thud of his own heart. But as he stepped off the porch, he stopped. The house behind him was awake. A faint clatter drifted out, metal touching wood, followed by the low hiss of a fire coaxed to life. Crow frowned and glanced at the chimney. For the first time in years, smoke curled into the sky before he had struck a match himself. When he came back inside after his chores, the smell met him at the door. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Bread warming near the hearth. Beneath it all, the faint, earthy scent of herbs simmering in a pot. The long table was set. Biscuits rested on a clean cloth. Emma Brooks stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, moving with quiet purpose. She turned when his boots crossed the floorboards. "You're back early," she said, as casually as if he'd been gone all afternoon. Crow looked from the table to her, suspicion tangling with something close to wonder. "You didn't have to cook," he said. "I did," she replied gently, not lifting her eyes from her work. "A house can't breathe without it." He hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat. She poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the wood. He lifted it, took a sip, and nearly paused in surprise. It was strong, bitter, alive. It had been too many winters since Crow had sat down to a real breakfast. Mary used to cook like this: venison stew, fry bread, roasted beans. After she was gone, he'd eaten only to stay upright. Jerky, hard tack, fuel, nothing more. But when Emma set a plate of scrambled eggs and warm bread in front of him, something stirred low in his chest. He picked up his fork. Slowly, almost uncertain, Emma Brooks ate across from him, her plate modest, her movements measured. She didn't chatter or crowd the room with words. She simply ate, the way someone does who understands quiet. She glanced at Crow once, as if gauging whether he might refuse what she'd set before him. He didn't. He finished every bite. When the bread was gone, he eased his plate back and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "There's more in the pot if you want," she said, a faint smile touching her mouth. Crow shook his head. "It's enough." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the heavy kind from the day before. It didn't press or weigh. It rested easy, the kind that belongs to two people sharing a table. From there, the days found a rhythm of their own. Emma rose before the sun, filling the kitchen with warmth. Crow came back from the corral to the smell of something simmering. He never asked her to do it, and she never asked permission. When the work piled up, she didn't stay inside. She stepped into it. She hauled water to the troughs, scattered grain for the chickens. One afternoon, Crow found her along the fence line, hammer in hand, setting a leaning post straight. He watched for a moment, a frown creasing his brow at the sight of her laboring in the dust. "You didn't have to," he said, again. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and met his gaze. "Neither did you," she said, nodding toward the land. "When you built this place." "But you did." Crow had no answer. One evening, after a long day riding the range, he came back tired and dust-streaked. As he stepped inside, he stopped short. The door to the side room Emma used stood half open. Warm lamplight spilled into the hall. He caught a glimpse of her bent over her small trunk, a mandolin resting in her lap. She was picking out a simple tune, soft, almost like a lullaby. It drifted through the house with a gentleness that wrapped around him. He hadn't heard music here since Mary's voice had gone quiet. He stood there longer than he meant to, listening, before turning away without a sound. The next morning, he left something on the kitchen table. A knife with a carved handle, his own work from years back. He said nothing. When he returned that evening, he saw she'd set it on the windowsill where the light could find it. She didn't mention it. So began their quiet exchange. Crow left small things: a pouch of dried berries, a carved hairpin, a handful of yucca seeds. Emma found places for them, not hiding them away, but honoring them. In return, she left signs for him: an extra biscuit wrapped in cloth near his saddle, a sprig of mint on the windowsill. They spoke little, but in those small, steady ways, the house began to fill. Late one afternoon, as the sun slipped low and washed the mesa in gold, Crow stopped at the fence line. A shape moved along the far ridge. The wild mustang again, a gray stallion with a mane like gathering storm clouds. Proud, untouchable, the horse had drifted across this land for months, never allowing a man close, never lingering in one place for long. Emma Brooks came up beside him, wiping her hands on her skirt. She stood quietly at his shoulder, watching the animal. "He's beautiful," she said. Crow gave a low grunt. "Wild. You don't break a horse like that. It comes and goes when it wants." Emma watched the stallion toss its head, sunlight catching along its neck. A faint smile touched her lips. "Maybe it isn't meant to be broken," she said softly. "Maybe it just needs someone patient enough to wait." Crow looked at her then, longer than he should have. Her words cut deeper than the sight of the horse itself. He turned back to the horizon without answering. That night they shared supper again. The lamp burned low, throwing long shadows against the walls. Crow sat with his coffee. Emma worked her needle and thread. The silence held. It wasn't heavy. It was easy. At last, Emma spoke into it. "I know you didn't plan on me being here," she said, "and I know I stepped into a place where I wasn't asked. If it's too much—" "It's not," Crow said, cutting her off. His voice was rough, but not unkind. She looked up, surprised. He met her eyes across the table. For the first time, his gaze wasn't guarded. "It's been a long time since this house felt lived in," he said. "You changed that." Emma said nothing, but her eyes softened. She lowered her head back to her sewing, a small smile settling at her mouth. Outside, the desert night stretched wide and endless. Inside Lone Mesa, two people sat in a silence that no longer hollowed them out. It filled them. Spring pressed deeper into Lone Mesa, though spring here carried no gentleness. The desert did not soften with flowers. It shifted with force. The rains came sudden and hard, driven down from the high ridges like a charging herd. By mid-May, the sky bruised dark and heavy, thick with purple clouds. Thunder rolled across the horizon, pounding so hard it rattled the floorboards. Crow had felt it coming all afternoon, the way the air thickened, the way the stock grew restless and quiet. He knew the mesa could swallow a man whole in a storm, and he meant to have his animals secured before the sky broke. He worked the corral with urgency, knots pulled tight, the feed shed locked down. Across the yard, Emma stood at the wash line, pinning shirts when the first heavy drops struck the dirt, kicking up sharp bursts of dust. Crow shouted across the yard, his voice fighting the rising wind. "Leave it!" "Get inside," Crow shouted. But Emma Brooks shook her head, clutching the bundle of clothes tight against her chest. Her jaw was set. "They'll be ruined," she yelled back. "Better wet than gone," he fired back. The storm didn't give them time to argue. Rain slammed down all at once, a solid wall of water crashing from the sky. In seconds, the world turned gray and roaring. The yard dissolved into slick mud beneath their boots. Crow swore under his breath and ran for the corral. The wind had blown the heavy gate wide open. One steer, panicked and blind with fear, shoved hard against the rails, threatening to burst free. Crow grabbed the gate, boots sliding as he strained to force it shut. The wind fought him. The animal fought harder. Then he felt another weight beside him. Emma. She'd dropped the laundry straight into the mud without a second thought. She planted her shoulder next to his, boots sinking deep, body braced. Together they shoved. Lightning tore the sky open. Thunder cracked so close it rattled their teeth. Neither of them flinched. Crow leaned his weight into the gate while Emma held the bar steady long enough for him to slam it home. Then, without a word, she was moving, running for the chicken shed where birds flapped and shrieked in panic. Crow followed, ripping a loose shutter free and nailing it back into place while she gathered the chickens under her arms. The storm howled around them, rain whipping sideways, noise and water everywhere. In the chaos, they moved as one. No commands, no wasted breath, only instinct and trust. At last the corral held. The shed stood firm. Crow caught Emma by the arm, shouting over the downpour, "That's enough! Inside now!" They ran across the yard together, soaked through, clothes heavy with rain. They burst onto the porch and collapsed against the doorframe, water pooling at their feet, chests heaving. For a long moment neither spoke. They just stood there, drenched and breathing hard, watching the sheets of rain hammer the land. Then Emma laughed. It started small, breathless, like it surprised her. She pushed wet hair back from her face. "Well," she said, catching her breath, "that's a welcome like no other." Crow blinked at her. It wasn't the storm that caught him off guard. It was the sound of laughter in his house again. He shook his head, water dripping from his hat brim, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "You'd rather I let the whole place blow down?" she teased as they moved inside, toward the warmth of the kitchen. Crow shook his head once. "You did good." The words were simple. Emma felt the weight of them all the same. That night they ate by lantern light while the storm battered the roof. When the plates were cleared, Emma leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed with exhaustion. "It's strange," she murmured. Even storms felt different when there was someone beside you to face them with. Crow looked at Emma Brooks, the lamplight catching the hard hollows of his face. He thought of all the nights he had endured alone, of Mary's voice that no longer filled the dark. He didn't speak, but his eyes said enough. Peace, he realized, wasn't always empty. Sometimes it was only waiting. But the desert was a land of extremes. The relief brought by the rain did not linger. Summer arrived early that year, heavy, unyielding. The days burned bright as brass. Sunlight baked the stones of the mesa until they could blister skin, and sweat stung the eyes the moment a man stepped outside. Crow worked through it all. He patched fence lines, pushed cattle toward higher ground, where a thin ribbon of water still ran, hauled supplies in from Santa Cruz. He never spoke of the toll it took. Emma saw it anyway. She noticed the deeper lines cut into his brow, the way he pulled his boots off more slowly each night. One evening, he came home later than usual. His horse was slick with foam, dust caked thick across his shirt. She had supper warming on the stove. "You've been gone since before sunrise," she said, rising to pour him coffee. "You didn't stop to eat." Crow shook his head as he lowered himself heavily into the chair. "Too much to do." She set the cup in front of him, studying his face. Beneath the deep tan, his skin looked pale. His lips were dry. When he lifted the cup, his hand shook. "You're worn to the bone," she murmured. "I'll be fine," he said, forcing a swallow. He grimaced as if the coffee burned all the way down. By nightfall, it was clear he wasn't fine. A harsh cough tore from his chest. When Emma touched his forehead as he lay back on the bed, heat scorched her palm. "Crow," she whispered, fear cutting sharp through her chest. "You've got a fever." He stirred, eyes barely open. "Just tired." "No," she said firmly, her heart pounding. "This is more than tired." She sat back, pressing her hands to her knees to still their shaking. The room seemed to tilt around her. She had seen this before. The sweat, the shivers, the burning skin. Her mind flew to another bed, another hand, hot in hers. She remembered Samuel Brooks coughing until his chest rattled, his eyes searching hers as she mixed herbs and whispered prayers. She had been a healer once, a doctor's wife. She had tried everything she knew. Nothing had saved him. She had buried him with dirt still beneath her nails, the same roots she'd gathered for medicine lying useless in the ground. That was the day she had walked away. The day she swore she would never touch it again. She hadn't even been able to save her own. People had called her unlucky, cursed. For a long time, she had believed them. Now, standing over Crow, listening to the ragged pull of his breath, that old fear closed around her chest like a fist. Every instinct told her to flee the room, to step back, to let nature decide the outcome. It was easier not to try than to fail again. Crow groaned, twisting weakly beneath the blankets. This house held no one else, only him, and her. If she turned away, there would be no one at all. Emma Brooks straightened suddenly. She seized a basin, filled it at the pump, wrung out a cloth and pressed it to his burning forehead. Her movements were sharp, almost angry. At him, at fate, at herself for hesitating. "You don't get to leave me too," she muttered under her breath. At first light, she made her choice. She stepped into the breaking dawn, boots crunching over gravel, and headed for the dry wash where she knew the herbs still grew. She gathered sage, yarrow, mint. Her hands shook as she worked, but she didn't stop. Back at the kitchen table, she chopped and measured, brewed and waited. A sharp, bitter scent filled the room. The smell of her past, the smell of her pain. She poured the mixture into a cup and carried it to his bedside. "Crow," she said softly, lifting his head, "you have to drink." He coughed, choked, but he swallowed. The hours dragged on, long and heavy. Emma kept watch, head bowed in prayers she barely remembered how to shape. She cooled his skin, sponged his arms and chest, whispered steady words to keep him tethered to the world. Near evening, she felt it, the heat breaking. Sweat beaded at his temples, but this time it was the cool sweat of a fever passing. His breathing slowed. His body finally settled into real sleep. Emma sagged back into the chair, exhaustion crashing down on her. Her hands smelled of sage and mint. Her dress was stained with sweat and broth. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the edge of the bed, and let the darkness claim her. It was deep night when Crow woke again. The lantern burned low. He blinked, disoriented, until he felt a weight near his hand. Emma sat, slumped in the chair, her head resting on her arm atop the mattress. He stared at her for a long time. Memory surfaced through the haze, the cool cloth on his skin, the bitter taste of herbs, her voice pulling him back. "Emma," he whispered, his throat raw. She stirred, lifting her head. Fatigue shadowed her eyes, but when they found his, relief washed over her face. "You're awake," she breathed. Crow swallowed hard, his voice rough and unsteady. "You stayed." Emma Brooks shook her head. "Don't," she said quietly. "I only did what I swore I'd never do again." Crow frowned, confusion cutting through the lingering weakness. What do you mean? She lowered her gaze to her hands, still faintly stained green from crushed leaves and stems. I was a healer once, she admitted. My husband, Samuel Brooks, fell ill. I tried everything I knew. Nothing worked. Her voice wavered, then steadied. When he died, I buried that part of myself with him. I thought if I never touched it again, I wouldn't have to feel that kind of failure twice. She took a breath. And then there was you. I couldn't stand by. I had to try. Crow held her eyes, steady despite the exhaustion that lingered in his body. He reached out, rough fingers brushing hers where they rested on the quilt. If you hadn't, he said, I'd be gone. You didn't fail me. He swallowed. You gave me back the breath in my chest. Tears filled her eyes. I don't know if I can carry that weight again, she whispered. His grip was weak, but sure. Then don't carry it alone. She froze. The words sank deeper than the fever ever had. The storm outside had passed days ago, but another broke in that room, quiet and close, leaving something tender behind. Fragile. Alive. They were no longer just two people sharing a house. They were survivors who had saved each other. By late summer, the land had hardened once more. Storm grasses turned brittle. The washes dried like old bones. On the surface, the ranch settled back into its quiet rhythm. Emma tended her garden, rows of beans and tomatoes fighting the heat, while Crow rode the range. Beneath that easy silence, something else simmered. It wasn't the unease of strangers anymore. It was the pull of words unsaid, feelings crouched in the corners like coyotes waiting in brush. The blow came on a Tuesday. Crow returned from Santa Cruz with a face dark as a thunderhead. He walked into the kitchen and set a folded letter on the table without speaking. Emma was drying dishes. She saw the set of his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. What is it? She asked. He sat, elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards as if they might answer him. Notice from the county office, he said, voice flat. If I can't show improvement, they'll review my claim to this land. The government doesn't like a man alone holding acreage. Emma set the dish aside, moving carefully. But this is yours, she said. You worked it. You built it. Crow's mouth tightened. Paper doesn't care about sweat. Silence pressed in, heavy and close. Emma felt a flicker of fear, not only for the land, but for what it meant to him. This place wasn't just ground and fences. It was his fortress. Crow stood there, staring at the letter as if it were a sentence passed down by a judge who would never show his face. It felt like penance, written in ink and law, an enemy a proud man couldn't strike or outwork. Crow, Emma began. He cut her off by standing too fast. Leave it be, he muttered, and walked out into the yard. For 2 days, he kept his distance. The house filled again with a heavy quiet, not the gentle kind they had learned to share, but a tight, strained silence that pressed in from every corner. Crow spent hours on the porch, eyes lifted to the stars, while inside the soft scratch of Emma's needle sounded too loud in the hush. The breaking point came on a warm night in early September. Cicadas screamed in the mesquite, an endless chorus in the dark. Supper was finished. Emma lingered at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with her finger. Crow stood by the hearth, arms folded hard across his chest. At last he spoke. His voice was low, stripped of the armor he had worn for years. When the fever took my wife and my boy, he said, staring into the cold fireplace, I kept telling myself I should have done more, found better medicine, fought harder, something. He shook his head slowly. Truth is, I couldn't save them. And I don't know if I ever forgave myself for that." Emma's breath caught. She looked at his back and saw her own guilt reflected there. "I know that feeling," she whispered. "My husband died. I was helpless. I told myself if I'd been wiser, faster, braver, maybe he'd still be here." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "People called me cursed, and maybe I believed it." Crow turned then. The rawness in his face startled her. "And now," she went on steadier, "I sit across from you, alive, because I broke that oath, and I think, maybe I'm not cursed after all." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It quivered. Crow stepped closer, slow, as if every step cost him something. When he reached her, he stopped. His hands clenched at his sides, then eased open. "I don't want to lose this land," he said quietly. "But more than that, I don't want to lose you." Tears slipped down Emma's cheeks before she could stop them. She stood, closing the space between them until she could feel the warmth of his breath. "You won't," she whispered, "unless you ask me to go." He lifted his hand then, calloused fingers brushing her cheek with care, as though she might fade if he touched her too firmly. She leaned into his palm, eyes closing. The kiss was unhurried, not fierce, not rushed. It was steady and sure, the kiss of two weary souls finally setting their burdens down. Together. Later, the cicadas kept singing outside, but inside the house, something long broken had begun to mend. They sat together on the porch bench. The desert night spread wide before them, carrying the clean scent of sage and cooling earth. Crow's arm rested along the back of the bench, Emma Brooks close at his side. "Whatever that paper says about heirs," Emma said quietly, "maybe this land just needed two people willing to tend it together." Crow turned toward her, his gaze steady in the moonlight. "Maybe," he said. "I just needed someone patient enough to wait." On the ridge beyond the house, the silhouette of the wild Mustang stood motionless. For the first time, it didn't look like a ghost to Crow. It looked like a promise. Autumn came to Lone Mesa with cooler nights, the air sharpening, the stars cutting bright against the black sky. The long heat of summer loosened its grip, replaced by winds that whispered through yucca and mesquite. For the first time in years, the turning season felt like an opening instead of an ending. Crow and Emma slipped into a new rhythm, quiet, certain. She still rose early to light the stove. He still rode out to tend the stock. But now, when he returned, her smile was there to meet him. And when they sat down to supper, he reached across the table to rest his hand over hers. They didn't rush to name what they shared. It didn't need a name. The land itself seemed to understand. One evening, Crow came in from the barn carrying something wrapped in cloth. Emma was kneading dough, sleeves rolled, flour dusting her apron. He set the bundle on the table and asked her to open it. Inside lay a necklace carved from bone, delicate and smooth, polished until it caught the lamplight. It was shaped like the petals of a desert flower. "My mother's design," Crow said softly. "In our way, it means a bond that's chosen, not by blood, not by tribe, but by the heart." Emma touched the cool bone, her fingers trembling. She looked up at him, eyes bright and steady. "Are you asking me to stay?" Crow shook his head gently. "No need to ask. You already have." Word traveled, as it always did in the West. When they rode into Santa Cruz for supplies, people noticed. They saw Crow, the solitary rancher, walking beside a woman. They saw Emma Brooks, the widow once followed by whispers of misfortune. Some looked on with curiosity, others with judgment. Crow answered them all without raising his voice. When he introduced her, He did it plainly, firmly. "This is Emma," he said. "She keeps my house, and she keeps my heart." For the first time in years, Emma felt no shadow trailing her. She stood tall, unafraid. Back at the ranch, the garden she had planted grew strong. And near the porch, the yucca crow had once given her bloomed for the first time. Great white blossoms opened wide against the desert sky. They were married there, beneath those blooms. There were no church bells, no crowd gathered in rows. Only Reverend Amos Reed standing in the dust with a worn Bible, and a handful of mesa neighbors bearing quiet witness. Emma Brooks wore her best dress, the bone-carved necklace resting at her throat, pale against her skin. When the vows were spoken, Crow bent to kiss her. It wasn't the kiss of a man claiming something new. It was the kiss of a man finally coming home. And as if the land itself chose to bless them, the gray stallion, the wild presence that had haunted the ridges, came down at last. One dawn, Crow found it standing calm at the corral fence. It didn't bolt. It didn't challenge him. It only watched. Crow smiled then, slow and genuine. "Looks like even the wild finds a place to belong," he said. Emma slipped her hand into his. "So did we," she whispered. That summer, a child's cry rose beneath the endless desert sky. Lone Mesa was no longer a place of silence and ghosts. It became something chosen, something living. A home, built by two souls who had carried grief, faced fear, and found, at last, the courage to love again. Their lives didn't erase the past, but they no longer lived inside it. They stood in the present, rooted in land and promise. No matter how hollow a house once was, no matter how heavy the quiet, a heart, given time, can learn to beat again. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.